Okay, we've discussed this before, but it's been about 2 years. And after about 2 years, you kind of forget things. After about 2 days, you kind of forget things.
I had to look at my driver's license some morning to say who I am.
I think I am. I am. I just have this. This is working. And a lot of times when we ask people ask questions about the Bible, or you hear people that have objections about the Bible, you want to be prepared to give that defense, that hope that is in you, that apologetic. And that's one of the things that I like to do is not only talk about defending the gospel message, the Bible, Christianity itself, but also equipping other Christians to do it, give them the information, and whether you have the depth of knowledge, or not necessarily the depth of knowledge, but the feeling. A lot of people don't feel comfortable doing it, and I understand that because we all have certain gifts that we're given, and some of us enjoy it. Some of us shy away from it because they don't like confrontation, or for whatever reasons there are. But I think having confidence in the Bible being what it says it is, the Word of God, and that the events that occurred in the Bible are true, having that confidence and knowledge of knowing that is critically important for a Christian, especially today when we need to share what we knew about the gospel and the faith that we have in Jesus Christ with others. And we need to do it with confidence because there's so many obstacles out there for people to come to know the Bible. There's so many people out there shouting down the message of Jesus Christ that I think it's important that we understand what the facts are surrounding it. The common objections are, Keith, can we advance? Okay. You'll have people that say, we don't know who wrote the gospel, even though it says Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. We don't know who wrote the gospel. And there are critics out there. There are biblical scholars out there that will say that we don't know for sure who wrote the gospel. Yes, sir?
You know how to write the Gospels if God wasn't around. I said, if God wasn't around, how did they know to write this stuff? Because people had seen, people had known. God gives them wisdom and visions to write these things.
He gave them inspiration. That's
Right.
what we say that the Gospels and the entirety of the Bible, the canon that we have today, is inspired Word of God. That does not mean that God provided them, took control of their hand and made them write, or gave them the exact words to regurgitate to people, but they were inspired to write what they did. Keith, this is not working for some reason, is it? Even on? Okay. And another objection is that the gospel writers were anonymous. Well, we don't know who the writers are because their books are anonymous. Save Luke. But I'll talk about why that's not a problem. And we don't have the original, which is true. We do not have any of the original copies of the Bible. Far from it. I think the earliest date that we have is a small fragment that's Papyrus 52. They number these things, and it's from the Gospel of John.
What about the scones?
What's that? And that's dated, I think, like 120 years, or about 90 years after the death of Christ. So there are strong objections out there about who the authors of the Gospels are, who the authors of the Bible were, and where does this information come from? So what I want to do is answer these. The first answer, of course, number one, is yes, we know who wrote the Gospels. Matthew wrote Matthew, Mark wrote Mark, Luke wrote Luke, and John wrote John. Now, was Luke an eyewitness to the events? No. But he got his information from eyewitnesses to the events. Was Mark an eyewitness to the events? Probably not. But he got his information from Peter. Well, how do we know these things? Thank you for asking. We'll talk about that here in a minute. in a minute. The writers were completely anonymous. Well, yes, they were anonymous, but if you look at the Gospels are considered biographies, the biography of what Christ did. And all of the biographies in the first century were written anonymously. So if they did put their name on them, people would come back on the other side. It's kind of a heads I win, tails you lose type scenario. They would say, well, look, we know these are forgeries. We know these things are bogus because they ascribe some type of identity to the writer. So over here they say, well, they're anonymous. We don't know who wrote them for sure. But over here, if they would have put their names on them, then they would have said, well, they're frauds. They're fraudulent because they put their names in there. So that's a silly argument. And then lastly, there we go. No originals. Why don't we have originals? Well, they were written on papyrus. And if you know anything about paper, how long would it take this paper to erode away? What's that? Yeah, it's going to disintegrate. Of course it's going to disintegrate. It's paper. I have a book at home that's dated to 1870 something. It is ancient, and the paper in there is very, what's the word I'm looking? Fragile? What? Yeah, it's crumbling, and that's just 100 years old, and it's modern paper. And papyrus is all it is just a bunch of, it's the leaves of reeds that are laid down like this, and then another bunch of reeds are laid like this, and then they're pressed together and then set out in the sun to dry, and then people would write on them. That's all papyrus is. And to think that the papyrus would last 100 years is absolutely crazy. To think that it would last 250, 300, 500, 1,000 years is absolutely absurd. 2,000 years, you're dreaming. But we do still have fragments of early Gospels. Okay. Now, when we look at the reliability of the New Testament, we have a whole bunch of writings up here. This is a chart. When we start talking about the number of Greek New Testament, the New Testament was written in what they call Koine Greek, and we have 5,686 different manuscripts to draw from. Now, that number fluctuates. Some people have put it up to 5,800. Some people have actually said, well, no, this manuscript goes with this manuscript, so the number goes down because they say, well, this is the same manuscript. It's just that it's two separate parts found in two separate locations. Okay, fine. But it's about 5,600 copies. 2.5 million pages is what it comes out to be. And it was written within the entirety of the New Testament, I would say, was written, we've discussed this before, within 40 years of the death of Christ. To include the Gospel of John, maybe the book of Revelation may have been written later. I don't know. That's something that I would have to do some further reading on. But the fact of the matter is that the entirety of the New Testament was written within the lifetimes of the majority of the people that lived at the time of Christ. And when we compare that to the earliest copies of other writings, historic writings, for example, Plato wrote in the 3rd and 4th century BC. The earliest copy we have of his is 1,200 years after he wrote it. But yet we believe that he wrote it and don't have any questions about who the author of that is. And we only have 7 copies of that. When you look at Tacitus, the Roman historian, wrote around 100 AD. The earliest copy of his writings is 1100 AD. That's 1,000 years, and we only have 20 copies of that. But yet we trust what Tacitus wrote as being accurate history. The Iliad, Homer, with the Iliad, the Odyssey, and Odysseus, and we know this. Okay, Troy. Was written 900 BC, and the earliest copy is 500 years after that. And we have 643, and you have about a 95% agreement between the copies. So 95% of the copies agree with one another. There's 5% that say, no, this word is not included, or this passage is included, and this one is not. So the copies are within agreement. Well, you get the New Testament. Now look at, they put the dates. Look at this date they put on that. I think that's way absurd to say that the book of Revelation was written 100 AD. That's crazy. But, okay. The earliest copy we have is 100 years after the death of Christ. And we have 5,686 copies. And you have over a 90, that number's been pushed up to about 99.75% agreement rate between the copies. And the differences that we have are, the majority of them are just spelling errors or word order. There are some significant differences between them. For example, some verses are left out, and some are included in others. The entire passage of the woman caught in adultery is left out of the earliest copy of John, but is later included in the later copies. So people, there's some disagreement or some argument that, well, that's not a part of the original copies. I think there's a good argument that it should have been in the original copies, but be that may. But that's just the differences that you find in the New Testament. But none of them impact the core teaching. The core teaching is that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. He was virgin born, lived a sinless life. He died on a cross in Jerusalem for our sins, and he rose again after 3 days. That's the core teaching. None of the books disagree on that. They all tell the same story. There are some differences in them, but they're not contradictory differences. A lot of people say, oh, there's contradictions in the Bible. No, there's not. But the Bible, the New Testament itself, you have different ways of telling the same story. For example, Simon the Cyrene carrying the cross to Jesus. Well, how far did Simon the Cyrene carry the cross? Did he carry it all the way from the time that the march from Jerusalem started out to Golgotha, or did it happen part way? There's differences on that. How many angels were seen at the tomb? One in one part, two in the other, one out in the field, one at the... But this is what you are going to find in eyewitness testimony. You do not ever have the same exact details of eyewitness testimony of the same event. And that includes today. And if you do, then you know that the people who witnessed it, they're colluding with one another, just to make sure that the stories match up. So when we look at a comparison of the New Testament to other ancient writings, the New Testament by far, is a superior document to anything that we trust before that. That's the point I'm trying to make. So the confidence that we can have in the New Testament is the New Testament that was in the first century is the same one that we have today. You can have all kinds of confidence that it is. Okay, so who do we know? How do we know that who wrote the Gospels? Number one, their authorship is not attributed to anybody else. There is nobody out there that says that anybody other than the Apostle John wrote the Gospel of John. There's nobody that says that somebody else wrote John. Or there's no other documents out there that say that John didn't write John. There's no other buddy attributing the book of Matthew to another writer, Mark to another writer, Luke to another writer. They all say that those are the people who did write these Gospels. And then we also have, Keith, the testimony of the early church fathers. The early church fathers tell us who wrote which book. And when I say the early church fathers, I'm talking about the earliest of early church fathers. And we'll go over that here in a second. And then we have evidence within the Gospels themselves that tell us that the people who claim to have they're attributed to are the ones that wrote the Gospel. I forgot to do this, folks. Admin thing here. Next Sunday, we're not going to have Sunday school. It's Christmas Day, but we are having church that at the normal time. We'll have church at 10:30, and that's the only service we're having that day. Next Sunday. We also are having a Christmas Eve service Saturday evening at 5. I didn't hear it. What's that? Yeah. And excited about that because that's kind of a tradition that my wife and I engage in is we go to Christmas Eve service, and I'm excited that we're having a Christmas Eve service here Saturday night. Okay, all right, so evidence from within the Gospels, and we'll talk about that as far as why they're attributed to who they are. Now, when we look at a chart of who the apostles were in the earliest writings of people who followed the apostles of Christ, of course, you have Jesus, and you have Paul over here, you have Peter here, and you have John here. One of the closest followers of Paul and Peter is this guy here. His name's Clement of Rome, and we have his writings. And then for Peter, he gave his gospel. What is going on here? Why isn't this working? Oops, what are we doing here? Go back. Go back. What is going on here? No, okay, so Peter gave his gospel to Mark. This is where we get the Gospel of Mark. And he also had a follower, excuse me, by the name of Ignatius. And Ignatius also knew John, the disciple John. And John had three students, disciples of his, which was Ignatius, Polycarp, and another guy by the name of Papias, who I don't have up on this chart. So when we look at Polycarp being a student of John, John being a disciple of Christ, you have this guy right here, Irenaeus. Irenaeus is probably one of the most prolific writers of the early church fathers. And we'll talk more about him here in a second. As a matter of fact, Irenaeus names all four of the gospel writers. So here within a generation, we already have a direct attribution to who wrote the Gospels by the early church fathers. And then with Irenaeus, you have a couple of his students, which Hippolytus, Justin Martyr, a guy by the name of Tatian. Tatian was the writer of a book called the Diatessaron. And the Diatessaron is, what it does is it combines all four Gospels into one big Gospel. So it draws all the information from each of the gospel writers and compiles it in just one big gospel. So that's kind of an important document from the 2nd century. And then, of course, you have Clement of Alexandria. So you have all kinds of early church fathers showing the relationship going from Jesus to the disciples, and then from the disciples to these people who followed the early church fathers. And when you look at how many attributions we have, for example, the time that they cite gospels, look at Irenaeus cites the gospel passages 1,038 times. Origen lived in the 3rd century, I believe, and that's 9,200 times. Hippolytus is 2nd century, 700 times. Eusebius is a church historian. But you have a total of 36,000 different citations from the New Testament by the early church fathers all the way up to Nicaea. And if you were to just get rid of all of the earliest copies of the Bible prior to Nicaea, we would still be able to compile the entire New Testament based on the quotations from the early church fathers because they commented on them so much in their writings. So we don't even need early copies of the New Testament. We do need them. But if we were to make the argument and say, look, well, you don't even have a complete copy of the New Testament before such and such and such and such a date, that's okay because we can go to the early church fathers and see them quoting from the New Testament in their writings. I think there's 11 verses that they don't, am I right on that, Keith? 11 or 12 verses is somewhere around there that they do not quote. And they're just completely innocuous verses that have no impact on the total message. So the fact that the earliest church fathers commented upon and used the writings of the New Testament, included the writings, the passage of the New Testament in their writings, is huge because we can have a lot of confidence what was taught by the early church by these guys here. Okay, Clement of Rome. Let's look at some of these guys. Clement of Rome is listed in the writings of Irenaeus. Irenaeus was a disciple of Polycarp, who was a disciple of John. So here you just have one generation removed, but he is mentioned by Irenaeus and another guy by the name of Tertullian as being the Bishop of Rome, and he was there from 88 AD to 99 AD. Now, if you remember, Peter and Paul both were martyred in Rome, and they both knew Clement. And so when we think of Clement having a direct relationship to the disciple Peter and to the apostle Paul, that's critically important because he would have been given the gospel message, some of the tenets of Christianity itself and teachings of Christ, and we find them in his writings. He's considered to be the first apostolic father and one of the three chief ones, which goes along with Polycarp and Ignatius of Antioch. And he became the leader of the church in Rome after the death of Peter and Paul. And he's essentially went out and taught what they taught. Whatever I learned from, I mean, if you look at Paul and what Paul discussed in the book of Galatians and in 1 Corinthians, he said, look, this is what the apostles taught me. I'm teaching you exactly what they taught me. Even though I wasn't an eyewitness, I'm teaching you what they taught me about Christ. And this is what Clement of Rome did. And we find these teachings in his writings. The next one, okay, so we see Clement of Rome. He's very early. You have Ignatius, and he was the disciple of John. Polycarp, disciple of John. See how early these dates are. Papias, of course, is another disciple of John. Justin Martyr was a disciple of Irenaeus. Irenaeus was a disciple of Polycarp. So as you see, they're very early. The point I'm trying to make you with this is how early these people are. After the death of Christ, right. So when we start looking at who's writing what, we can see that there's a line of succession, a line of teaching. This is not an oral tradition, as most traditions at this time were, but this is a written tradition, which is critically important. Because in oral tradition, you can have embellishment, you can have people, getting facts wrong, and then you can have all kinds of arguments and say, no, I remember it this way, and this person over here, I remember it this way, so who's right? How do you prove who's right? Well, you don't, because it's an oral tradition. But here you have a written tradition developed in the early church. Okay, so the Apostle John taught, Papias, Polycarp, Ignatius. You know how I keep mentioning this? The more times you mention it, people have a tendency to remember these things. So Papias, we don't have anything today, any of the writings of Papias. The writings that we have of Papias are contained in the writings of Irenaeus. Because he'll cite what Papias said or what Papias had written. So we don't have the originals. We don't have the originals, any of these originals, but we do have copies of them. But they will cite other people. They say Papias wrote such and such. And this is how history is done. We have documents today that cite, what's that guy's name? Thallus, a guy by the name of Thallus. Well, Thallus, writing in 52 AD, 22 years after the death of Christ, mentions the death of Christ. Him and another guy are having an argument about something about the day turning into night or something. They're having this argument, and they're talking about Christ. Well, we don't have anything that Thallus wrote, but we have other people in their writings mentioning what they read about or from Thallus. So you have people that are close to that time writing about what existed. And that's generally how the historical method is done when you start determining historical facts. So Papias lived from 60 to 135 AD, and he's known as a hearer of the Apostle John. He was a friend of Polycarp, of course. If you're going to Polycarp being one of the chief students of John, and he became the bishop at Hierapolis, known, I can't even pronounce that word, but it was in Turkey. understand that it was in Turkey. And he knew the oral testimonies from the eyewitnesses. And he wrote these down himself, and he also had read the early documentation from the Gospels themselves. So he was aware of their existence. And let's see, he wrote a 5-volume treatise called The Interpretations of the Sayings of the Lord. And, oh no, his work is, I was wrong. It wasn't Irenaeus that quotes it. It's Eusebius who quotes him and alludes to many of the gospel passages and stories. And he is the one that provides another link, one of these links when we talk about a chain of custody of the Gospels. He's one of those people that provide that link. And I mentioned earlier about the woman caught in adultery and how we know that should be included in the Gospel of John, even though it's omitted from the earliest writings, and that comes from Papias. Papias quoted John talking about that story. So since Papias mentions that, and even though it's not in the earliest copies, we can make that connection that that story should be in the Gospel. And I mentioned that one morning. I said, well, the story of the woman caught, I mean, that's the most beautiful story. I mean, if you think about it, you know, the forgiveness involved in that, and the absolute beauty of Christ being shown in that, and then to say, oh, well, it never happened. It's just a made-up story. I mean, that'll break your heart. It's like, you see, it's even in all the, all the movies about Jesus. If you think about all the movies about Jesus, it was in the Passion of the Christ, for crying out loud. It's the most beautiful story, and think that that doesn't belong in the Gospels. Well, it hurts your heart as a Christian, but does it affect your faith, though? I mean, does it affect the overall message of the Gospel? No, it does not. I mean, does it affect your salvation? No, it doesn't, but it is a beautiful story. Okay. So we see where Papias belongs right here. This is where Papias belongs, even though he's not on this chart. I don't know why these charts don't include him, but there you go. Okay, Polycarp. Do we have time for Polycarp? Polycarp is pretty lengthy because, well, let's go ahead. Okay, so he's a friend of Ignatius and Papias, and he's a student of John, one of the chief students of John. He's known to be converted by the eyewitnesses, the apostles themselves, and he becomes the bishop of Smyrna, which is in Turkey, Izmir, Turkey. And he writes a letter to the Philippians that references 14 of the New Testament books. So here you have late 1st century, early 2nd century, referencing several of the earliest books of the Bible by one of the early church fathers. So when we start saying, okay, how do you build a case for what is in the Bible? Should Galatians be in the Bible? Should 1 John, 2 Peter, should all of these epistles be in the Bible? Well, we can do the history of it or the attribution of these things by going to the early church fathers and saying, okay, well, who do the early church fathers quote? Who do the early church fathers say wrote which letters? For example, 2 Timothy. Well, how do we know that Paul wrote 1 Timothy or 2 Timothy? Well, we can go to the early church fathers and see who they're attributing authorship to these letters are. And we can trust that they are inspired. And he demonstrates the early texts were in circulation and familiar to the earliest churches that we find in the book of Acts that we're going to study next. I'm kind of excited that you mentioned it. I don't want to spend 2 years on it, though. I think that's a great idea. I know, I'm going to have to figure out, well, I don't want to figure out how just to blow through it, but at the same time, anyway. Okay, so when we look at who Polycarp was, here you have Jesus, his apostle John, and then he is one of the first disciples of John, teaching what John had told him to teach, what John had, this is the important part, witnessed himself. That's the important part, what John had witnessed. So you have the testimony of a witness to the events, now providing that firsthand knowledge to a student of his, and we have the writings of that student today. We'll finish this up next week. Oh, don't have Sunday school next week. Come on, Miller. I know, we're frail and fragile. I don't know if are we having Sunday school New Year's Day? Have we talked about that? Okay. Okay.